Well, good deal. Well, thank y'all for joining us this morning. This is our third session of the Range and Pasture Winter Webinar Series. Kind of get you ready for the pasture season and get everybody in the know for how we can best service our pasture acres. So we're going to first start it off with some introductions. So I'm Spin Oliver, the Associate Territory Manager working in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and temporarily filling in for Tanner Smith, who isn't able to make it out with us today. But Abe, feel free to introduce yourself.
Well, good morning. My name is Abe Smith. I work in eastern Nebraska as well as Iowa. I live out of Kearney, Nebraska, operate out of Kearney, and have been with the organization for over 25 years. A lot of those spent with our range and pasture products.
Good deal. So as we're getting started today, we're going to have plenty of opportunities for questions. So whenever one pops into your head, if you wouldn't mind dropping it in the Q&A tool on the top of your screen. What that's going to do is we're going to kind of work through it, whether answer the question in the moment or take them all at the end. We'll play it by ear, but please drop your questions in there. We'll be happy to answer them. So kind of a quick agenda for the next 30 to 45 minutes. We're going to dive into kind of what's new from Corteva, some of the best practices we've seen and how we can best serve our pasture acres, and a little more of the technical details with grazing and manure restrictions, and continuing with some of those best practices with brush control, as well as growing the business. So we're going to get right in and starting off with what's new from Corteva. And you may see some familiar names from some familiar brands, but we're going to talk about how you can best put those to use and some new ways you might can differentiate your operation and broaden your market there. So the first we'll talk about is DuraCore, which we're in our, I believe, 4th or 5th season with DuraCore. So you may be familiar with Grazon Next, which has traditionally been the pasture residual broadleaf control product. And what DuraCore is going to do is it's going to take a step into this generation with a modern formulation. So DuraCore has aminopyrrolate or milestone, the same rate as Grazon Next, but whereas Grazon Next has 2,4-D, DuraCore is going to have a new active ingredient called Rinskor Active. Rinskor is the first new active ingredient brought into the range and pasture market for almost 15 years. And what that's going to do is what it brings to the table on top of what Grazon Next did is it's going to add 40 new species of broadleaf weeds, compared to just 100 of Grazon, and you have 140 with DuraCore. And Rinskor is also going to improve your risk profile. So it's got a reduced volatility risk, low odor, and lower application rates. So Grazon Next goes all the way up to 34 ounces, whereas DuraCore goes down to 20 on the top end. So you're going to improve your efficiency, improve your confidence with these applications, and improve the overall sprayability in that you're going to control a broader range of species there. Some of the key species we always talk about that DuraCore performs well on, you're going to see improved performance with your locust, hemlock, carrot, buckthorn. So a lot of those wild carrot, Queen Anne's lace, things like that. DuraCore is going to show improved activity there. It mixes very well with other herbicides, which we'll talk about a little bit later, to kind of give you a broader activity and a increased opportunity to provide a quality product on all your acres. And as we'll get in here in a second, it's pasture weed and feed ready. So you can impregnate it on DuraCore or on dry fertilizer through a program called UltiGraze, which we'll touch on here in a bit. It also mixes well with UAN as a liquid fertilizer. So great opportunities there for expanding your business that way. So what this is going to do is it's going to lead to our first poll question, and I'll launch it here. Let's see. So this one should come up. Can y'all see this question?
Yep.
Good deal. Yep. So does your location sell pasture fertility, as in farmer applied or custom apply pasture fertilizer. So give y'all a couple seconds to get those responses in.
Well, we got half the people that are confused about the question, perhaps.
So we got a couple more trickling in, and then we'll review the answers. All right, so walk through these. Yes, we've got 50% saying that a majority of your business is farmer applied, whereas 36% saying both farmer and custom applied, so both mixed. And we know that it can be kind of a niche market depending on the area you serve, but it can be a great opportunity to differentiate and provide not only just the herbicide treatment for these pasture acres, but also to improve their forage opportunities as a whole. And one opportunity that we have, and we hope to make a beneficial tool for you, is a program called UltiGraze. So it is, like we say, one pass better grass. It is dry fertilizer impregnated with Duracore. So this isn't a product you would stock on your shelf. It's a service a retailer would provide. So you'd be a certified UltiGraze retailer, and the blending processes would all be done in-house and provided through the retail location and sent out to the farmer that way. Now, obviously, one of the biggest concerns is cross-contamination and making sure that we are aware of where all of that herbicide is going to be, especially when it comes to soybean programs, and making sure there's no issues there. Because we know that Duracore is extremely effective on pasture broadleaves, and it's very effective on soybeans as well. So we want to make sure we don't have any issues there. So one way we try and be mindful of that is getting innovative with how we can blend the fertilizer. And one way we do that is through a tender truck. And I can show a little video here. So it'll go back. There we go. Yes, you can mount a herbicide tank on a tender truck with a pump and nozzles to blend fertilizer within the auger. So what that's going to do is it's going to keep that herbicide in a concentrated area to ensure that it's not going to interfere with any other programs you may have, as well as provide an easy route of entry for a new market, just because we know it's something new that you may not have done before. So we want to make sure that we're being mindful of how to best use your resources. And this is sort of an example of how that would look after a impregnation. So you'll see here in a moment that the fertilizer is coming out the end of the auger, and we always recommend that you use a dye just to ensure we know where that fertilizer is going, and make sure that your crew knows that it's going out on pasture. In this case, it's blue, but depending on your operation and what your other fertilizer programs are, we can definitely modify that to make it work for y'all. But UltiGraze is a way you can provide a new market for your customers and provide a higher level of service that is not only agronomically beneficial with improving pasture fertility, but also improving efficiency and having one pass across the pasture to knock out both aspects. So the last thing I'll mention, and then I'll turn it over to Abe, is a product we have that's pending EPA approval. It's called Proclova. So what Proclova is, it would be a non-residual herbicide for selective weed control that is going to be safe on white clover. So oftentimes there's a pretty tremendous gap when it comes to making a decision on whether or not to treat the weeds in your pasture and maintaining some of those beneficial forbs. What Proclova is going to do is bridge that gap and give you an opportunity to control some of your invasive and non-desirable weeds and maintain your clover that provide great forage quality. It's also good for wildlife food plots. So if you have customers that are looking to get a little extra life out of their food plots, they can apply Proclova and maintain that white clover in their plots. It's going to carry the same broad spectrum control as the new active that was in DuraCore. It has Rinskor active and Proclova as well, with a reduced rate of 2,4-D that's going to be safe and tolerant on that on those white clover species. So we're still waiting on that one. EPA approval is pending for that one, but hopefully we'll get that within the year. So I'll turn it over to Aiden.
Yeah. One of the newest additions to our lineup is a product that we brought into the marketplace last year. Was previously known as Grassland L, but really didn't find a good fit, and we're relaunching it as Grazon PD3, which is kind of the next generation of Grazon P plus D, is kind of how I position it. And Grazon PD3 is going to be a valuable asset for many of your customers because it now is a Grazon P plus D with the 2,4-D choline that we utilize in Enlist 1, as well as the picloram that makes the base of that product. And this gives your customers a better experience because it is a very low odor product compared to the old Grazon P plus D. It's non-volatile. Both those AIs are now non-volatile. It's not going to pick up and move on them. And I believe at the end of the day, it's going to spray really well for many customers. And it's used at a lower application rate. It's roughly 2/3 the rate previously. So if you were using 3 pints of Grazon P plus D, that rate is now 2 pints. If you're using previously 2 pints of P plus D, that rolls down to about 30 ounces of PD3. And so we think there's some real advantages here. It is at cost parity to what Grazon P plus D is as well, and programs are very similar. So we think that this would be some low-hanging fruit to help improve your customers' experience overall. Just with a little bit of retraining, we offer things like some rate cards, some rate cards to help people make that transition into calculations, so we can simplify this for many guys that are really looking to make that switch. And then we also have I have available some measuring cups if you're looking for some things to offer to customers to help aid that transition. Printed right on there, 64 ounces to 40 ounces and so on. So we can help you make that case. And I really love this product. I think it's going to really find a niche here with the new Grazon name, as well as the price parity that we're at. Let's talk about, shift gears. We'll talk about just timings and products, just some of the general recommendations we make, and just the reasons why we treat weeds when we do out there. And if you have questions pop up, feel free to put those into the Q&A. Be happy to address those. So let's ask you, when asked the best time to spray pastures, what are you most likely to recommend? So what do you end up recommending for timings? There's no wrong answers here, just non-participants if you don't answer. Okay. Got pretty good participation this round. Go ahead and show those if you would, Spen, or maybe if everyone can see it. So we have several fans of spring, about 7, about same number of fall, and 3 just spray it, which I think is probably the best answer here. Oftentimes when I'm asked this question, I go back to customers and say, I can make you the best recommendation. I think there are for specific weeds, there may be a better time to spray than not. But oftentimes what determines maybe the best opportunity is when the customer has time to do it. And so working with those customers, there's definitely some ideal timings, but either one of these can be effective. So we'll talk about spring, fall, and the just spray it category as we address each of these down the road. Let's go ahead and pull that down, and we can go to the next slide, Spen. So for spring application, I tend to focus on weeds that are early, young weeds, 8 to 12 inch tall weeds, approximately May through June is that spring timing. What we're targeting in that time frame is going to be things like summer annuals or winter annuals, even henbit, cocklebur, things like vetch or marijuana, sometimes kochia over in South Dakota, eastern Nebraska. Snow on the mountain might come up in that conversation as well. Then you have things like biennial weeds that we are very familiar with musk thistle, as well as things like bull thistle, or you get into the other biennials we run into, mullein, we'll talk about, I believe, curly cup gumweed, goldenrod, absinthe wormwood, sweet clover, the carrot species, which Duracore ends up being pretty good on, and then the perennial species, ironweed, vervain, and probably most notably, Canada thistle is one of those perennial weeds that comes back year after year. And if you're here from the Dakotas or eastern Nebraska, you'd also put leafy spurge into that category as well. And so there are some ways that we might treat perennials differently, which we'll talk about, and timings. So if you have certain weeds you're trying to control, if you're in for some annual weed control, you can't control annual weeds in the fall. We're going to have to target them in the spring. In my opinion, for many customers, the best value that they get the most weeds treated for one price, treating with a spring application, like a Duracore from 16 to 20 ounces, as well as a Grazon Next. You could go from 28 to 34 ounces. We do recommend NIS with both of those. I've been communicating this winter and early spring that probably one of the best things that you can do for your producers that come in and they buy some herbicide to spray on rangeland is to make sure that you're sending them home with an NIS. I run into a fair amount of folks that don't know what an NIS is. They often pronounce it NIS. What is a NIS? And so you know that they don't know what it is. But having a good surfactant in there to make sure that that spray spreads on the leaves can actually make a world of difference in terms of how they're experiencing their pasture weed control. So that would be something to really consider significantly. As we look at the fall sort of application, let's go to the next slide there. We're going to spray from early fall to that ground is frozen. And that's generally going to be somewhere from mid-September to mid-November, depending on where you're located at. Again, we're not going to treat summer annuals in the fall. Those have flowered out. They're dead and gone for the season, and they're really not going to come back. And yes, while we do have some residual control from some of our products like a Duracore or Grazon Next that can be sprayed in the fall, oftentimes the amount of residual is not going to be meet expectations for a spring residual control. Will there be some? Yeah, there will be some, but again, it's not what we're going to promote. It's not what you should be promoting for a fall application. But we're going to focus instead on biennials and perennials. And so things like thistles again, musk thistle, plum musk thistle, bull thistle, common mullein, the carrot species oftentimes fall into that category. And then perennials like musk thistle, or excuse me, Canada thistle, as well as leafy spurge. They can be sprayed post-frost if they're still growing. And as long as we will get these freeze temperatures, we will have a hard frost. As long as the ground isn't frozen, we can still be pretty effective. Now, when the just spray it folks, spray it any time of year. I will say that I do get a fair amount of requests from Iowa around spraying in August and early September. And it is not ideal. I understand why customers might do it, and I understand the timing works out really well for their windows trying to apply those things. But just understand when we're talking about biennials and perennials, all those plants are going to flower usually in a June timeframe. And from that time they've flowered to when they start to regrow in the fall, they don't do a whole lot. So July, not a great time to spray weeds. You can get some residual product down on the ground, but it's not going to be as effective as waiting a couple months till we start to see those rosettes come back. We start to see some new growth on those. And it's not going to happen usually in July when things are hot and dry. Usually we need some weather conditions that are positive around that. Personally, I wouldn't spray until August 15th at the earliest. I would much rather see you wait till September 15th because I think producers get the best bang for the buck. Now, would I tell them to not do that if that's the only window they can spray? No, I would just be make sure that we're communicating with them this may not produce the ideal results that you expect because we're not seeing active growth out of these weeds. For fall applications, we do recommend, we tend to drift towards the higher end of the rate range because we're addressing biennial and perennial weeds. And those have been very effective rates at Duracore 18 to 20 ounces. I believe Duracore or Grazon Next is the best Canada Thistle product out there today still. And for customers that have endemic big Canada Thistle problems, they're not going to get them all in one fell swoop. This may be a process. And the other aspect of recovering ground that has been inundated with Canada Thistle can also be what their grazing patterns are or their management, how intensive they're managing those things. If you put a lot of pressure on a piece of ground, we're going to have thistle problems probably for a longer period of time, even with good herbicide treatments. Now, I do see a question in the chat about curtail. Many of you may be aware that curtail is no longer being sold by Corteva. We've taken it out of production. What are some of the replacement options that we have for curtail? And curtail is a product we did not talk about. Curtail is a clopyralid and 2,4-D product that's been around probably for 30 years or close to 30 years. It's been a solid product, but it's been one that was driven by the cereals market. It has not been driven by the CRP marketplace, which is where it's found a niche in much of these markets. So replacement options for curtail, I would put Duracore or Grazon Next right up against curtail in many aspects. I think you get better Canada Thistle control, number one. I think both are non-restricted. So you have non-restricted Canada Thistle control. But for customers that want a more clopyralid-related option, we probably end up looking at a product called Wide Match, which is another clopyralid-based option for cereals, but also has CRP on its label. And Wide Match is generally sprayed at a pint to a pint and a third. And it's probably priced very similarly to what your curtail acres may be. Now, again, clopyralid is a substandard treatment compared to aminopyralid for Canada Thistle control. But there may be reasons why customers want to use clopyralid, maybe for rotational flexibility. So with clopyralid, and if they decide to take that acreage out of CRP and put it into soybean production or corn production, clopyralid allows you a known rotational category. So your rotational flexibility with a product like Wide Match may be quite a bit better than an aminopyralid or even a Grazon PD3, which does not have the flexibility and has the residual that hangs around a little bit longer. So there's some good reasons to utilize a product like Wide Match, but I think once we understand the goals of the producer and that CRP, if the goal is to maintain the flexibility, I think Wide Match from Corteva makes a really good option at a pint to a pint and a third. Otherwise, products like Duracore make a really solid case and I think actually improve their control options in those CRP acres. Rotationally, Duracore or Grazon Next, it's going to say field bioassay in the label, which is a sexy way of saying you need to do a soil test or more specifically plant some beans in that topsoil to see if they grow, to know if you can plant beans. Generally speaking, experientially, your mileage may vary. I'm not guaranteeing this by any sense, but for soybeans, we're usually seeing a 2 to 3 year window before they can be replanted, but you're going to have to follow those field bioassay recommendations to make sure that that happens. Let me know if there's further questions on that, but that's the way I would address curtail in our geographies. Okay. Let's go on to the next slide there, Sven. So my best recommendations for things like thistle, again, Duracore is my number one option, whether it's for musk thistle or Canada Thistle. Duracore 16 to 20 ounces in the spring with an NIS. Looking at the higher rates in the fall, 18 to 20 with an NIS. If you have leafy spurge, specifically in northwest Iowa, into the Dakotas or northeast Nebraska, 60 to 80 ounces of Grazon PD3 has been working very well. That's going to deliver you roughly a pint of Tordon and a pound of 2,4-D. I think it's a really solid solution for you. And then for Iowa, specifically, we have a weed called wild parsnip that causes a lot of skin irritations, can cause injuries not only on animals, dogs, cattle, but also humans. Causes skin irritations that boil up and they It's ugly stuff if you haven't seen it. So it's in the wild carrot family. Duracore has been exceptional on that wild carrot family, and specifically wild parsnip. I couldn't recommend a product any higher on wild parsnips than Duracore. A pint has been doing a really good job for significant heavy problems. It may be good to look at that 20-ounce rate. Got a question in the chat before we move on. When's the best time to kill thistles before they go to seed? Question. And spiny amaranth, both. Can it happen in one shot? What product and rate? The best product that I have for both of those right now, I believe, is Duracore. At a pint is going to be the general time frame, and that would be primarily looking at summer, spring, summer. So I would say in that May to June time frame. There are occasions where we run into situations where weeds don't grow at the same rate at the same time. And so we try and find areas where we have some overlap of both of those. Spiny amaranth tends to be one of the later ones. Some thistles might be on the earlier side of that. The later that you can wait, probably the better opportunity you have to kill both in one shot. Generally for thistles, if you read our label, we would say we want to spray thistles when they start to bolt, meaning they start to rise up out of the ground before they flower, maybe when the buds are really coming together. But we have seen very positive results on spraying flowering plants. And I would focus on bolt more than I would flowering, but I think knowing the customers that I've had, usually by the time you get the questions, bolt looks like a full flower for many customers. So it's always better to spray on the earlier side than not in that sort of situation. But hey, if I spray my budded thistle, is that going to actually sterilize the seed? Is that going to impact seed production? The answer would be, it depends. Just like you can't spray herbicides on corn or beans at certain points in time without affecting, you'll create crop injury. And the same thing's going to happen with a weed of any variety, is you will cause seed decrease just by treating that plant. The viability of that seed probably goes from 100% down at least to 50%, if not lower. Just like you see damaged kernels on a corn plant, you're going to have damaged seeds on the seed head of a plant that's sprayed, even though it's right at that bud stage. So it's better than doing nothing. The best thing would be to spray them before they get fully flowered, and spray them in that bolt as they're starting to bud. Okay. Let me know if there's other further questions on those. So can we spray Duracore or Tordon around trees? The answer is, well, very carefully. It depends. I tend to keep Tordon away from all trees that are desirable. It's a good rule of thumb to stay out of the drip line of those trees to avoid infiltration into the tree's root system. And Duracore, though, the aminopyrrolid piece has been much safer around many trees, except for things like locusts or things that are leguminous. Carragana might be another one. Redbuds might be another one. If you have desirable trees, make sure you ask a question to Spen or me or Tanner. We can sure guide you around that situation. But also, we'll talk about brush control here at the end. There are some options that are relatively soil neutral, based around remedy, or many of you are familiar with crossbow, that might be better options for situations like that. Okay. As for adjuvants, what adjuvants should we use with Duracore or Grazon Next? I would include in that. When you have situations, high temps, low relative humidities, drought conditions, you have dusty conditions, a quart per 100 of NIS is the recommendation. I don't use MSO until later in the season. 1% MSO can work very well, but we will get some grass burn just because of MSO, because it causes grass burn. And but again, for larger weeds, if you're talking weeds over 12 inches up to 24 inches, it would probably be a reasonable thing to say, hey, throw in an MSO here. Let's make sure we can burn those things down well.
Good deal. Thank you, Aiden. Yeah, I just dropped a link in the chat to a ShowPad article. It's got several resources it mentioned on the previous slide, but it's got several resources that y'all are free to download, save on your desktop for future use whenever you have questions on range and pasture. It gives you some pretty general recommendations and product attributes that may help on some of those calls. So we're gonna take the next couple of minutes to walk through grazing, haying, and manure restrictions that come with a lot of our products. We know that in order to control a lot of these difficult to control weeds, that residual activity is going to be essential. But with that comes some stewardship that we want to make sure that we follow and are mindful of. So the first thing we want to talk about is grazing restrictions. So just from a definition standpoint, grazing restriction is any special instructions pertaining to applying the herbicide in areas currently grazed by livestock. So that means livestock are in the field at that moment of application. And one important distinguishing factor the label mentions is it distinguishes between lactating dairy livestock and all other livestock. And whenever you read a label and notice grazing restrictions, see if it mentions lactating dairy as opposed to all livestock, because that's a pretty important distinction when it comes to an operational standpoint of being within label recommendations. So falling under no restriction is Duracore, Grazon Next, Remedy Ultra, and Proclova is anticipated to have no grazing restriction. And if you notice on the right column right there that has a restriction, notice they are all limited to lactating dairy animals. And each will have their own time period following application that there cannot be lactating dairy animals on that site. So Grazon PD3, no lactating dairy until 7 days post application. Remedy and Crossbow, no lactating dairy animals until the following growing season. And then Tordon is 14 days post application, and P plus D is 7 days application, post application. So make sure we're mindful of that and know that it doesn't apply to our cow calf operations. That, you know, if you've got a mom cow nursing a calf, it's not the same as a lactating dairy animal. That's a dairy animal whose milk is being harvested for sale. So be aware of that. The next topic of stewardship is along the haying and manure restrictions. So the definitions here are special instructions regarding the harvesting, movement, or use of herbicide-treated hay and manure. So whenever we think about our product portfolio, we like to think of it in two groups or families. The first of which being amino pyrrolate or milestone products. That's going to be your Duracore, Grazon Next, Chaparral, and of course Milestone. And the second being Pechlorium products or Tordon, which is Grazon PD3, Grazon P plus D, and Tordon 22K. So these products, these two families, are going to have soil residual. That's what makes them so effective on a lot of these difficult weeds. And we want to make sure we're mindful of their haying and manure restrictions. So this is specific for Duracore, but it reflects the stewardship of residual products. And I'm not going to go through and read every bullet from this point, but what I do want to mention, if there's one number that we can remember when it comes to soil activity and residue activity of Duracore and other amino pyrrolate and pechlorium products, is 18 months. So from the time you apply, that starts a clock, an 18-month timer, and that is the amount of time that herbicide is going to be active within the soil, within the plant matter, and within animal manure that's been grazing that plant matter. So when it comes to harvesting hay, if you cut hay on a Duracore treated pasture, that hay will have residual herbicide activity. And if your state isn't covered with a supplemental label, you cannot move hay that's been treated with Duracore or other amino pyrrolate products off the farm. And that's a restriction just to ensure that there's no issues when it comes to herbicide activity after the hay is sold off farm. And similarly with manure, if you have cattle that are grazing herbicide or Duracore treated pasture, their manure is going to contain residual herbicide activity. So you can't collect that manure to be spread on crop ground. You could store it for a period of 18 months. Similarly, you could do the same with hay. You could store it for 18 months to allow that residual to break down. And from that point, it would be fine to use, but manure and hay will carry it for 18 months. If your plan is to collect manure from livestock that have been grazing treated pasture, or you want them to run them out on crop ground, it's important to let those livestock graze untreated feed for a period of 3 days. We say 3 to 7 days to be sure that the rumen and the digestive tract has been cleared from any of that treated feed, just to make sure that there's no more residual activity. And you're free to collect their manure, run them out on crop ground that'll be planted back next year, to not have any worries of any residual activity carrying over there. Yeah, Abe, any points I missed there?
No, I think you handled it pretty well. This may be also one of the differentiations with the curtail questions or clopyralid. I don't remember off the top of my head if there's any similar restrictions. I believe there likely would be some, because clopyralid, similar to many of these products, doesn't just disappear immediately. So you would have to have some awareness here, but generally it's probably not going to be to the degree we're seeing here with Duracor. So another thing I could do a little bit of looking into. If you want the answer to that question, please let us know in the chat, and we'll figure out who you are, and we'll get that information to you directly.
Sure. And I know I've briefly touched on supplemental labeling. So the revisions that supplemental labels allow for is for hay movement off farm or ranch, as well as and harvesting, silage, haylage, baleage, things like that. And if you're on the call from North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska, your states are covered with supplemental labeling, whereas the other states will fall under the categories of hay movement restrictions that we talked about earlier, following that 18-month guideline. And there's an additional supplemental label that allows for use on rights of way and utility lines that transect graze areas, and that'll be North and South Dakota that have that revision as well. So just some additional pieces there to consider when using any of our residual products.
So let's talk about brush control. Not a popular subject, but one that is unique to the range and pasture business. And while we do wish there was a kind of a silver bullet for everything, species matters and timing matters. This ends up being pretty prescriptive in terms of how we recommend it, just because of the species specificity that we need, and timings don't always work for everyone. But we do have a lot of tools and resources to get you the right direction with some brush, and we want to delineate out the types of treatments that are out there: foliar versus basal bark or basal brush, and cut stump treatments, and how to access our brush control tools. So foliar is where we're spraying leafy material, green and leafy material. These applications don't happen in May in our geography because there's very few leaves on them. We generally would target foliar treatments in a July or an August first, just because we have the full leaf out of that plant. And so we have good coverage. Oftentimes these are not necessarily broadcast treated. On smaller trees, if you're looking at stuff like Spen's got there with the common buckthorn, you're not running a commercial machine over that. So something like that's getting sprayed with handgun or IPT done out of a UTV or an ATV from a producer. And so good coverage is really critical, and timing is really narrow. But where there's also the opportunity to do basal bark treatments, where we're treating the bottom 12 to 18 inches of a tree trunk with a herbicide like Remedy herbicide and basal oil or diesel. And these are best on trees that are smaller, 6 inches or less. It's a chemical girdling. It destroys the cambium layer of that tree. And that oil basis, using basal oil or diesel, that allows that the triclopyr ester that's in Remedy to act almost akin to a transdermal nicotine patch, where that material stays active for longer and can actually translocate or move into that plant for a longer period of time than if we were to just spray it with even a triclopyr amine, which dries down to a salt crystal. You can't move a salt crystal through a plant tissue, but you can move an oil-based material through there really well. And this is something that we can do in dormancy. There's a lot of folks that will do basal bark treatments from September all the way till March, and while you don't have leaves on, you can increase your effective application time. And then with cut stumps, using a similar mix to basal, where we're just applying to a cut stump. They've chainsawed it off or ground it off. They want to treat not only the stump, but you want to treat the cambium layer, that that outer quarter to a half inch of that stem that's above, and any exposed roots. So this may be a case, especially basal bark or cut stump. If you do want to be selective and surgical in removing those trees, they may need to be cognizant of any exposed roots from adjacent trees around. And so something to be mindful of. These treatments with the basil oil or diesel can be very, very effective. I will also add, we've had get very common questions on Remedy Ultra versus Remedy Herbicide. Why don't you have Remedy Ultra anymore? Remedy Herbicide came back about 3 years ago during COVID windows, where we were having tough time sourcing certain inert ingredients for Remedy Ultra herbicide. And so as a means to stabilize our production, to make that more known, we've shifted our production primarily over to Remedy Herbicide, which ends up being a kerosene-based formulation. It gives a lot quicker and visual activity. It's actually maybe even a better version of Ultra. The Remedy Ultra was introduced because it was a lower VOC category of product that allowed us to move into some different areas with that product. Lower VOC aside, we were having a tough time finding the inerts that we needed to make that consistently. So you'll see us primarily from here, at least for the foreseeable future, continue to use Remedy Herbicide as our primary product. There's no difference in pricing between them. There's no different than programs, and there's no different in use rates. So for many folks, it's been a relatively seamless transition, other than, well, I want my Remedy Ultra. And I understand, but there's really no difference that you'll be able to tell, and your customers actually may end up liking Remedy Herbicide a little bit more than they liked Remedy Ultra. We do want to encourage you to continue to be interested in growing your pasture business overall. We think there's real value here. We think there's a lot of value that you can help producers unlock, because there's a lot of pastures that go untreated. There's a lot of net new acres out there. You don't have to go to bat for the acres that your competitors are selling to. Many customers have acres on their own property that they're not treating right now. And we need to understand maybe a little bit more why. But oftentimes it's because they don't understand the value of what a herbicide treatment on these pastures might be able to do. I've consistently been taught and educated in pretty consistent message from me when I'm in front of producers. If we can take a pound of weeds off that pasture, we're going to put a pound of grass on that pasture. It's not unfamiliar for us to be able to move production up on a pasture a ton and a half, depending on what their productivity levels are. And we can actually put more grass on that pasture for customers that they're having to buy less supplemental feed, or they're not having to feed corn. They're not having to go source hay. They're able to actually improve some things out there. And by demonstrating some interest in this pasture business, you have a lot of potential to get in front of a customer for the first time, maybe with a unique path and a unique message to them, and demonstrate to them that you're a little bit more proficient than just the corn seed, bean seed, and the herbicide package, the fertility packages that you offer. It is something that be relatively unique. And several of our range and pasture products, not all of them, but several, are participating in True Choice, which still may have some utility to several of your customers today if they have unutilized balances in their accounts. We have some time for Q&A, so feel free to throw some things into the Q&A in the chat. We'd love to be able to address those specific questions. We have about 15 minutes left before 10, and we don't have to go that whole time. So did want to make mention of Remedy versus Remedy Ultra. What other things top of your mind, Ben, or if you see some things come in there?
Yeah, one question that's kind of came in a while back was, when it comes to wanting to seed new grasses into your pasture,
Yeah.
you talk about, do you apply herbicide before you seed? Do you seed and then wait till a couple weeks after to apply your herbicide? What's the best strategy there?
This can be a real timely question for many producers, and it's important to get this thing right. My preference is to is to actually spray first and then seed. The reason for that is a couple fold. With Duracore as well as Grazon Next, our reseed windows for that is usually 30 to 45 days, depending on your rate, maybe up to 60. But you can do a lot of good in a season and have some residual control out there for some weeds. If you plant grass first or other seedlings out there first, herbicides are likely to damage them unless you're going to wait 6 to 8 weeks until you have that secondary root growth out there. And I think that there's a large opportunity to actually regress your new seeding if you go in there and spray herbicides, especially at the rates that you may want to. And understand there's a great desire to go out there and defend that seeding that you took. But oftentimes, high rates of growth regulator chemistry like a Duracore or Grazon Next or even a 2,4-D at the high rates can actually be harmful to the seeding that you've spent money on and invested in. So just be aware, spray first, then seed. If you spray here in April or May, you can get out there and you can seed later this summer or into the fall. Some folks maybe here, if you got out there this week, perhaps you could get out there and 45 days would put you roughly to May 10th. You could seed in May if you're out there spraying today, possibly.
Great. We got one question coming in the tool is some recommendations for killing Russian olives.
Yeah. We've been pretty effective spraying Russian olives foliarly with Remedy herbicide. That would be probably at a higher rate. So you'd want to make sure you have probably a quart to a quart and a half per acre. That would be my general thought. Basal bark treatments would also be a solution. Would be interested in talking with you a little bit more about killing Russian olives, the size of them. So if you can define a little bit more of the size that you're talking about here, small ones should be controlled pretty well all day long with Remedy on its own. We do have a second Pasture product called Pasture Guard that might actually offer some value there on that with a second AI called Fluroxypyr in there. Something like that could be sprayed a pint and a half to 2 pints and probably might be a beneficial addition there. I do see another question there. If you treat leafy spurge with PD3, do you suggest Tordon follow-up in the fall? If so, what rates? If they're going to spot treat, I wouldn't recommend a back-to-back broadcast treatment of PD3 and then Tordon. Probably would encourage them to go out in the fall with some spot treats of Tordon, probably in that 24 to 32 ounce an acre spot treat sort of rate. For me and the resources that we use, Spen, I know you put your resources up there. I do have a link that I share with my customers that has a table on there for spot treats. And so in my mind, 24 to 32 ounces an acre spot treat is probably going to come down to pretty close to that rate per 25 gallons is where I'm going to start. So 24 ounces per 25 gallons or an ounce a gallon, you could say. And that should give you something they could go out there and spot treat pretty effectively. Again, throw an NIS in there. You're not going to hurt anything. You're probably going to help some things in the fall. I think it's a pretty good value. I hope that helps. Other questions? Appreciate both those questions, all three of them. They're really timely.
There you go. Thank y'all for being willing to chime in. And if I don't see any else filing in, I guess we'll wrap it up. Give you some time back on your Thursday. But we thank you for joining us on the call. We hope it was beneficial to you and you're able to kind of go into some of these pasture calls with a little more confidence, a little more understanding of how we can best work together to provide a high level of service. But we've got a list of the folks on the call. We'll follow up with an email next week with the recording as well as our cooler winner. And we'll follow up with you on that to get your address and things like that. But thank you for your time, and we hope you have a great start of your season.
Thank you guys so much. Appreciate your time.